In this tutorial we're going to look at solving another programming problem using Python, and in particular combining the while loop from our previous tutorial and the if statement from some tutorials ago. So the task that we're going to set ourselves is this. We need to write a program that asks the user to enter a password. They should get 3 attempts at entering their password before the program stops them trying again. So, again, like any problem we're going to solve in Python, we need to take it in steady steps rather than try and solve it all in one go. Now, this problem has some similarities to a previous problem we solved with a password, and this is one of the key things that we've got to start to understand and learn about programming, in that we've got to bring our knowledge from solving previous problems to solving the current problem. So the first thing we're going to need to do in order to solve this problem is to create a variable to hold the password that is correct. And the password we're going to set is our usual friend, let me in. So I'm simply declaring a variable called password and assigning it the value let me in. Now, let's go back and have a look at the original problem scenario. We've got to limit the number of attempts that the user has at getting the password correct. So this implies that we're going to have to keep track of something. We're going to have to keep track of the number of attempts or tries that they've had. So we're going to create a variable called tries, and we're going to assign it 0, because at the very beginning of running this program they haven't had any tries. We also need to be able to flag up once they get the password correct. So we're going to create a variable called correct, and this variable this time, instead of holding string values, text values, or numerical data, is going to hold what's called a Boolean value, a true or a false value. And in this case we're going to assume that at the moment they've got the password false. So correct is going to have the default value false. Once they've entered the correct password, we can then set this to true, and that will indicate that they've got the password correct. So obviously this program has an element of repetition, because we're going to have to give them 3 attempts at entering their password. Now we could use a for loop to solve this, because we know how many times it's going to repeat. However, if they get the password correct on the first attempt, then it only needs to execute it once. If they get it correct on the second attempt, 2 times, and then only if they haven't got it right on the second attempt will it ask them a 3rd time. So it's not always going to execute 3 times. It could simply execute the once if we get it right the first time. So for this reason we need to use a while loop. And the condition is going to be slightly more complex than our previous conditions, because we're going to keep going so long as they haven't had 3 tries. So we'll keep going so long as tries is less than 3. But there's also another condition that could stop this loop needing to be repeated again, and that is if they get the password correct. So we only need to repeat this while they're still not getting the password correct. So we'll add the condition correct equals false, and both these conditions have to be true for us to repeat the loop. So we've now created a loop that says while the tries is less than 3 and correct equals false. So we'll keep going so long as they haven't had 3 tries and they haven't got the password correct. So we're now inside the loop. First thing we obviously need to do is ask the user to enter their password. So we'll create a variable called attempt, and we'll assign it whatever they enter into an input box. And because of course the password can contain letters or numbers, we need to use raw input, and we'll ask them to enter their password. And of course, because they've had 1 attempt at entering their password, we need to increment tries by 1. So we'll add 1 to tries. Now that we've got their password in, we need to check to see if they've actually got the password correct. Now, because we need to check this, we're going to use an if statement, and the if statement will simply be if the attempt equals the password, then they've got it correct. So we can say correct equals true. Notice, because it's a Boolean value, it has to start with a capital letter. So let's have a look at what we've got so far. We've set up a variable called password, which contains let me in. We've created a variable called tries to keep track of how many goes they've had at getting the password correct, and initialize that to 0. We've also created a Boolean variable called correct and made the assumption that they haven't got the password correct to begin with. Now that we've initialized these variables here, we can get the first attempt in from the user. And we've used a while loop to do this. And the condition for the while loop is while tries is less than 3 and correct equals false. So it will keep executing this code here so long as they haven't used up all of their tries and so long as they're still getting the password wrong. So we ask them to enter the password, increment tries because they've had one go now at getting the password in, and then we'll check to see if their attempt at the password matches. If it does, we can set correct to true. Obviously, once we set correct to true here, that would then stop this loop being executed any further times, because correct would equal true, and therefore we'd drop out and we'd do whatever code was down here. Similarly, once tries is incremented enough times, then this condition here will be false, and again it will drop out and do something down here. And this is now what we need to set. We need to tell it what to do once we've had enough attempts or once we've got the password correct. So we need to add another if statement. And we need to see if they got the password indeed correct. So if correct equals true, then they must have got the password correct in one of their 3 attempts. So if this is the case, we can then say print password correct. Obviously, if correct isn't true, then we need to set up an else condition and inform them that, sorry, you had 3 tries. So let's review what we've got here. We've initialized password to be let me in, set the number of tries that they've had to 0 and correct to false. We're then going to repeat this code here inside the loop so long as tries is less than 3 and so long as correct is still false. We'll ask them to enter the password, store it in attempt, increment the number of tries that they've had, and then see if they've got the password correct. If they've got the password correct, we'll set that to true. Once this loop is finished, we can then see if indeed they got the password correct on one of the 3 attempts, and if so, print password correct. Otherwise, we need to print no, you had 3 tries. So let's see what happens if we run this program. It should ask us to enter the password. So let's get the password correct on the first attempt. Let me in. Click on OK, and it's output password correct as expected. Let's run it again. This time let's get the password incorrect. That was our first attempt. This is our second attempt. This is our third attempt. And obviously now, because we've had 3 attempts, it's outputted, sorry, you had 3 tries. And this concludes this tutorial.